The plate shattered against the wall of the Silver Spur Saloon, and every head in Dusty Creek, Texas turned toward the woman standing in the center of the room with fire in her dark eyes and mud still caked on the hem of her traveling dress. "You will not speak to me that way," Winifred Collins said, her voice low and precise and carrying a danger that had nothing to do with volume. "Not today. Not ever again." Hattie Morse, the woman who had appointed herself the moral authority of Dusty Creek since approximately 1878, stood with her wide hat and her wider mouth open in outrage. The woman beside her, a pale creature named Edith Sallow, covered her lips with a gloved hand. Around them, cowboys and merchants and ladies in their Sunday best stood frozen mid-sip, mid-bite, mid-sentence. "She threw a plate," someone whispered from the back of the saloon. "She threw it at Hattie Morse," someone else responded, and the weight of that distinction was immeasurable. Winifred had been in Dusty Creek for exactly 4 hours. In those 4 hours, she had learned that her trunk had been misrouted to El Paso, that the boarding house she had arranged by letter had burned down 2 weeks prior, and that the woman who ran the only other option for accommodation in this town was standing right in front of her telling her that respectable establishments did not welcome women of uncertain reputation. Uncertain reputation. That was the phrase Hattie Morse had used. Winifred had asked, very calmly, what that meant. Hattie had told her, in excruciating detail, what the letter she had received from Winifred's former employer in San Antonio had implied. Winifred had listened to every syllable of it. And then she had picked up the empty ceramic plate from the nearest table, and she had thrown it at the wall, 2 inches to the left of Hattie Morse's head. Not at her. 2 inches to the left. That was an important distinction, and one that Winifred intended to point out if asked. "I came here to work," Winifred said, lifting her chin. "I came here because the telegraph office posted that the schoolhouse needed a teacher. I came here with 4 years of experience and 2 letters of recommendation, and I have committed no crime against this town or anyone in it. Whatever Harriet Boone wrote about me in San Antonio was written out of jealousy and spite, and if anyone in this room would like to verify my credentials, I will gladly provide them." The silence stretched like taffy being pulled in summer heat. It was into that silence that the door to the Silver Spur swung open, and a man ducked his head under the frame because he was tall enough that the frame presented a genuine obstacle. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual labor rather than vanity, with dark hair that needed a cut and a jaw that held 2 days of stubble, and an expression of mild curiosity as he surveyed the room. Clement Warren took in the broken plate on the floor, the red-faced Hattie Morse, the open-mouthed Edith Sallow, and finally the woman standing in the center of it, all with mud on her hem and ice in her eyes. He set his hat on his knee, turned it twice in his hands the way a man does when he is deciding something, and then he looked directly at Winifred Collins. "I've got a table in the corner," he said. "You look like you could use a meal. You're welcome at it." It was not a dramatic declaration. It was not a rescue. It was an invitation extended by one human being to another, stated plainly and without condition. But in the context of that room, with Hattie Morse still sputtering, and every eye fixed on him and on her, it was the most powerful thing anyone had said in Dusty Creek in a very long time. Winifred looked at him for a full 3 seconds. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly. Then she smoothed the front of her traveling dress, stepped around the broken pieces of plate with deliberate care, and walked to the corner table where a cup of coffee and a half-eaten meal sat waiting. She sat down across from a stranger in a town that had already decided to hate her, and she picked up the fork. That was the beginning of everything. 3 weeks before that moment, Winifred Collins had been sitting in a lamplit office in San Antonio, staring at the letter of dismissal that her supervisor, one Harriet Boone, had placed on the desk between them with the delicate satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for an opportunity. "You understand why this is necessary," Harriet had said. She was a woman of 50 with tightly pinned silver hair and the particular brand of moral righteousness that made itself felt in every room she occupied. Winifred had understood nothing of the sort. She had read the letter twice, and then she had looked up at Harriet Boone and asked what, specifically, she had done wrong. The answer, delivered with great reluctance and even greater relish, was this: she had been seen speaking at length to the man who owned the building that housed the school. His name was Mr. Garrett, he was married, and someone had told someone who had told Harriet Boone that the conversation had seemed overly familiar. There was no more to it than that. A conversation, a man, a marriage that had nothing to do with Winifred. And yet between those three facts and the machinery of small-town gossip, a story had been constructed. "I spoke to him about a leak in the roof," Winifred had said. "That is not what was reported." What was reported, Winifred had said very evenly, was a fabrication. Harriet had folded her hands on the desk and said that she could not take risks with the reputation of the school. Winifred had picked up her letter of dismissal, folded it precisely in half, and placed it in her bag. She had not raised her voice. She had not cried. She had gone home to her rented room, and she had sat for a long time in the dark, and she had thought about what it meant that a woman's entire livelihood and reputation could be dismantled by a single conversation misread by a single pair of eyes. Then she had gotten up, lit the lamp, and started reading notices in the newspaper. She had found the one about Dusty Creek within the week. The schoolhouse needed a teacher. The town was growing. She had written her letters of recommendation, written to the school board, and received a reply within 10 days. The position was hers if she arrived by October. She had packed everything she owned into a trunk, bought a train ticket, and left San Antonio without looking back. She had not known about the boarding house fire. She had not known about Hattie Morse. She had not known about Clement Warren or his corner table, or the particular way a man could change a woman's entire day simply by offering her a seat. But she was learning all of these things now. Clement Warren, she discovered over the course of that first meal, was not a man who talked much unless he had something worth saying. He told her his name. He told her he ran a cattle ranch 4 miles north of town, the Warren Spread, which his father had started and which he had been running alone for 5 years, since his father passed. He told her that the schoolhouse was still standing, that it had survived the same fire that had taken the boarding house because the wind had been blowing the other direction. He told her that the school board president, a man named Aldous Crane, lived on the main street and would see her the next morning. He did not ask her what the trouble was about. He did not comment on the broken plate. He simply refilled her coffee from the pot that the barkeeper's boy brought over, and he listened when she spoke, and he did not look at her the way the rest of the room was looking at her, which was to say, he did not look at her as though she were a problem. "I need somewhere to stay tonight," she said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. He looked at her for a moment. "The Haskell farm sometimes takes in travelers. Martha Haskell won't give you trouble. How do you know what she will or won't do? Because Martha Haskell hasn't listened to a word Hattie Morse has said in 20 years, and she isn't likely to start now." Winifred found herself almost smiling. "You know this town very well. Lived here my whole life." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Small towns have long memories. That's a blessing and a curse depending on what they're remembering. And what will they remember about today?" He met her eyes across the table, and she had the startling sensation of being looked at by someone who was actually seeing her, not the story the room had already written about her. "They'll remember that you didn't back down," he said. "In my experience, that matters more than the rest of it." She stayed at the Haskell farm that night. Martha Haskell was exactly as Clement Warren had described. A broad, sensible woman of 60, who asked no questions beyond whether Winifred took sugar in her tea, and who showed her to a clean room with a real mattress and a washstand and a window that looked out over a field going golden in the late October evening. Winifred washed the road off her face and sat on the edge of the bed, and she thought about the rancher in the corner of the Silver Spur saloon, who had ducked his head under a doorframe and changed the temperature of an entire room with 8 words. She thought about it rather more than was strictly practical for a woman in her situation. The next morning she met Aldous Crane, who was a thin man with reading spectacles and an apologetic manner, and who confirmed that yes, the position was hers, and yes, the schoolhouse was ready, and no, he had not heard anything untoward about her background, and he looked uncomfortable when she mentioned it, which told her that he had heard something but was choosing to ignore it, which was the best she could hope for. The schoolhouse was a single-room building on the edge of the main street, with real glass windows and a cast-iron stove and 23 desks of varying sizes arranged in careful rows. It smelled of chalk dust and pine and the particular sweetness of a room that has been used by children. Winifred stood in the middle of it, turned around slowly, and felt for the first time since San Antonio that she was standing somewhere she was supposed to be. She started teaching the following Monday. There were 18 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they came from the farms and ranches scattered around Dusty Creek, bundled against the November chill and carrying their lunch pails and their slates. They were curious and fidgety and entirely manageable, and Winifred discovered within the first hour that she was very good at her job, which she had always known but which it was gratifying to confirm. She saw Clement Warren again on the Wednesday of that first week. He was in the general store when she came in for chalk and a new ink bottle, and he was arguing mildly with the storekeeper about the price of feed sacks, which appeared to have gone up since the previous month. He noticed her when she came in and stepped to the side to let her reach the counter, and he touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "How's the schoolhouse?" he asked. "Exactly right," she said. "Thank you for telling me about Mr. Crane. Did he give you trouble?" "Less than I expected." He almost smiled. It was a near thing, a slight shift at one corner of his mouth, but Winifred had been watching for it without quite knowing she was doing so, and she caught it. "Good," he said, and turned back to his argument with the storekeeper. She bought her chalk and her ink bottle and walked back to the schoolhouse and stood outside it for a moment in the thin November sunlight, with the smell of wood smoke coming from the houses along the street and the sound of a wagon somewhere in the distance. And she thought, very clearly and rather against her will, that this town might actually become home. The problem was that Hattie Morse had not finished with her. Hattie Morse was a woman who operated on the principle that information was currency, and that reputation was the economy in which that currency was spent. She had been the primary social authority in Dusty Creek for 15 years, and she regarded the arrival of Winifred Collins with the focused attention of someone who senses a threat to an established order. The broken plate had not helped. The fact that Clement Warren had offered her a seat in public had not helped. The fact that Aldous Crane had given her the teaching position, despite the whisper campaign Hattie had already initiated, had not helped at all. So Hattie did what Hattie had always done. She talked. She talked at the ladies' auxiliary meeting. She talked at the Methodist church in the careful way that makes itself sound like concerned prayer. She talked to the wives of the men on the school board, one by one, in a sustained and patient campaign that stretched over 2 weeks and covered ground as methodically as a farmer plowing a field. The content of her talking was this: that Winifred Collins had been dismissed from her previous position under a cloud of scandal, that the nature of the scandal involved a married man, and that it was irresponsible to put a woman of such uncertain character in a room full of children who were impressionable and whose parents deserved better. She never said outright that any of this was true. She never had to. She said that she had heard things, and that she was worried, and that she thought perhaps the school board ought to look more carefully into the matter. And she said all of this in the soft and mournful tone of someone who takes no pleasure in being the bearer of difficult news. Winifred heard about it from Martha Haskell, who had taken to stopping by the schoolhouse after the children left with updates that she delivered in the brisk manner of a military report. Hattie spoke to Clara Pendleton yesterday, Martha told her on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, settling herself into the chair by the stove with the ease of someone who has decided to be useful. Her husband is on the school board. He is, I should tell you, a sensible man, but Clara is not. What did she say? What she always says. Implications, suggestions, that particular brand of venom that sounds like virtue. Winifred was erasing the day's lesson from the slate board. She did not stop doing so. What do you recommend? Martha Haskell looked at her with the frank appreciation of someone who respects practical thinking. I recommend you keep doing exactly what you're doing. The children like you. 3 parents have already told me so directly. Hattie's currency spends less well when it runs up against reality. And the board. The board meets the first Friday of December. I'd attend if I were you. Not to defend yourself, mind, just to be there, present and unrattled. It tends to work. Winifred nodded and continued erasing the board. She was grateful for Martha Haskell in the way that you are grateful for a compass when you are not entirely sure of your direction. What she did not tell Martha was that the Whisper campaign was affecting her in ways she had not expected. Not her position, at least not yet, but her standing in the small daily transactions of the town. The woman at the dry goods store who had been friendly the first week was now cool. The wife of the Methodist minister turned slightly away when Winifred passed on the street. Small things, barely visible, but cumulative in the way that a dripping roof is not dramatic until the bucket overflows. She understood the mechanics of it. She had seen it done before, in San Antonio and in the town before that. She understood that it was not about her, not really, but about the particular anxiety of a small community that polices its own boundaries through reputation and exclusion. She understood all of this intellectually, and she still found herself lying awake at night in Martha Haskell's spare room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the particular loneliness of being seen only as a story someone else is telling about you. It was in this state of mind that she encountered Clement Warren again, on a Saturday morning in late November, at the edge of town, where the road split north toward the ranches. She was walking because she walked every morning when the weather allowed, and he was on horseback heading back from a supply run, a bay horse loaded with saddlebags, and he pulled up when he saw her. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, in the way that men who live plainly sometimes say plain things without meaning to be unkind. "That is a very forthright observation," she said. "Sorry," he said, and actually seemed to mean it. She looked up at him on the horse, squinting against the pale morning sun. "I've been hearing that Hattie Morse has been making my life very interesting behind my back." "I've been hearing that too. And what do you think of it?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was weighing his words the way a careful man does when he has strong opinions about something and wants to express them accurately. "I think Hattie Morse has been the expert on everyone else's business for so long that she's forgotten what her own business looks like. And I think you've done nothing to deserve it." He paused. "Also, I think anyone who's spent 5 minutes in your classroom and come out thinking you're a bad influence on children has something wrong with their eyesight." Winifred stared at him. "You've been in my classroom." He had the grace to look slightly caught. "I had to bring the Pardo boy home last week. He fell off a fence and cut his hand, and his younger sister is one of your students. Mrs. Pardo asked me to let the teacher know he'd be out a few days. You could have sent a note." "I was already coming into town." She looked at him for another moment. "And what did you think? Of the classroom? Of the lesson?" He turned his hat in his hands again, that same gesture from the saloon. "You were explaining fractions, with apples. You'd cut up an actual apple and you were walking around the room letting each child hold a piece. The little Vargas girl, she's been having trouble, everyone knows it. You'd given her the piece with the core, and you were explaining why the core counted just as much as any other part even if it looked different." He met her eyes. "I thought you were very good at your job." Winifred was not a woman who was easily moved. She had made a policy of it, after San Antonio, after the dismissal, after the long journey on a train across country to a town she did not know. But something in the plainness of his observation and the precision with which he had remembered the detail of the apple and the Vargas girl struck her somewhere unguarded, and she had to look away briefly at the pale winter fields. "Thank you," she said. "That is a kind thing to say." "It's a true thing," he said. "I don't much bother with kind things that aren't true." She believed him. That was the disorienting part. In her experience, men said flattering things as a kind of currency, expecting something in return. Clement Warren did not seem to be spending anything. He seemed to be simply reporting what he had observed, and then waiting to see what she did with the information. "I have the school board meeting in December," she said. "Martha tells me I should attend." "Martha's right. I'm not sure what to expect. Expect Hattie to have already talked to at least 2 board members. Expect Aldous Crane to be on your side but nervous about it. Expect the 3rd member, that's Roy Pendleton, to be waiting to see which way the wind blows." He pulled gently on the reins as the horse shifted. "Go anyway. You don't need all 3. You need Crane to hold firm." "How do I make sure of that?" "You already have. Keep teaching the way you're teaching." She nodded slowly. Then, because she was honest in ways that sometimes surprised people, "You've been very helpful to me since I arrived here. I'm not sure what to make of it." He looked at her steadily. He had very dark eyes, she had noticed, the kind that did not flicker away when they were meeting yours. "I don't make it a habit of watching someone struggle when I can do something about it," he said. "That's all it is." It was not all it was, and she suspected both of them knew it, but she appreciated the simplicity of the framing. He tipped his hat and rode on toward the ranch road. She stood at the fork for a moment after his horse had rounded the curve, and then she turned and walked back toward town with the wind at her back and her hands in her coat pockets, and something warm and complicated moving through her chest that she declined, for the moment, to name. The December school board meeting was held in the back room of the town hall, which was also the room where the town council met, and where records were kept in wooden filing cabinets that were falling apart at the hinges. Aldous Crane sat at the center of the table with his spectacles on, and his expression carefully neutral. Roy Pendleton, a large florid man who ran the feed mill, sat to his right with the look of a man who would prefer to be somewhere else. Clara Pendleton's husband, it turned out, was not Roy Pendleton but his younger brother Frank, who was a compact, watchful man with the eyes of someone who reads situations carefully before committing to them. Hattie Morse was not on the school board. She was, however, in the room, in the front row of chairs set out for observers, in a hat that suggested great moral seriousness. Winifred sat in the second row. Martha Haskell sat beside her. To Martha's right, which surprised Winifred considerably, sat Clement Warren, hat in his hands, long legs stretched out before him, looking as though he attended school board meetings every week of his life. She had not known he was coming. She caught his eye across Martha's shoulder, and he gave her the smallest possible nod, which communicated nothing beyond the fact that he was there and he knew she had seen him, and he was not going to make it a production. Aldous Crane opened the meeting and introduced the items for discussion, the first of which, somewhat to Winifred's surprise, was not her situation, but rather the question of whether the schoolhouse needed a second stove for the winter months. This occupied 15 minutes and resulted in a decision to investigate costs. Then Aldous cleared his throat and said that he understood there had been some community discussion regarding the qualifications and character of the current schoolteacher, and that the board had considered the matter and wished to address it formally. Hattie Morse leaned forward in her front row chair. Aldous Crane looked directly at Winifred. "Miss Collins, the board has reviewed your letters of reference. We have received a letter this week from the school board in San Antonio, which notes that your dismissal was a matter of administrative restructuring unrelated to professional performance." He paused and looked at this document over his spectacles. "Your teaching qualifications are not in question. Your conduct in this community, from the accounts we have received from parents of students, has been entirely appropriate. The board sees no grounds for any action." Roy Pendleton said, "Hear, hear," with the decisive enthusiasm of a man who has chosen his side and is relieved to have done so. Frank Pendleton said nothing, but he looked at Winifred and then at Hattie Morse, and then he wrote something in his notebook. Hattie Morse stood up. "I would like to address the board." Aldous Crane said, carefully, "This is not an open forum, Mrs. Morse." "I have information relevant to the matter is closed," Aldous said, and there was something in his tone that Winifred had not heard there before, a firmness that suggested he had been working up to this moment. "Miss Collins is confirmed in her position. We thank the community for its interest in the school, and we encourage everyone to focus their energies on supporting the children's education." Hattie Morse sat down. Her face was a study in controlled outrage. The meeting concluded 17 minutes later. In the corridor afterward, Martha Haskell took Winifred's arm and squeezed it, and Aldous Crane shook her hand with awkward sincerity, and Roy Pendleton said that his daughter came home every day with something new she had learned, and he was very glad to have a proper teacher in the schoolhouse. Clement Warren fell into step beside her on the way out of the building. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Better than I expected to be," she said honestly. "Crane wrote to San Antonio 3 weeks ago," he said. "His idea." She stopped walking. "You knew about that." He paused too, and they stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the town hall in the cold December air with their breath making small clouds between them. "I went to see him the morning after I ran into you on the road. I told him what I thought of the situation. He'd already been thinking the same thing. He just needed someone to confirm that he wasn't the only one who saw it clearly." Winifred looked at him. The cold had brought color into his face, and he held his hat against the wind with one hand, and he was watching her with that steady, uncomplicated attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, all the time, with everything. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't want you to count on it in case it didn't work. But you did it anyway." "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. "Why?" The wind picked up and he resettled his hat and looked out at the main street for a second before he looked back at her. "Because you deserved someone to stand in your corner," he said. "And because the alternative was standing around watching something unfair happen, and I have never been able to do that comfortably." There was a great deal happening in his dark eyes that his plain words were not quite containing, and Winifred felt it, felt the edge of something larger and more complicated beneath the practical surface of the conversation, but neither of them moved toward it. "Not yet." "Thank you," she said, and this time the words were carrying considerably more weight than the last time she had said them. "Come to dinner Sunday," he said. "Martha and a few others, nothing formal. My place." She considered it for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said. She told herself it was because she was trying to build a life in this community, and Sunday dinner at the Warren Ranch was a practical step in that direction. She told herself this several times over the next 2 days, and each time she told herself it was slightly less convincing, but she persisted. The Warren Ranch was 4 miles north of town on a road that in December was cold and clear and bordered by winter grass the color of wheat. Martha Haskell drove them out in her wagon, along with a woman named Rosie Delacroix, who ran the post office and had a laugh that started somewhere deep in her chest, and arrived in the room a full second before the rest of her. Rosie had decided, apparently on first meeting, that she liked Winifred Collins very much, and she said so directly, which was so disarming that Winifred had found herself liking her back immediately. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story structure of stone and timber that sat back from the road behind a windbreak of bare winter cottonwoods. The barn was well kept. The fences along the approach were straight and whole. It was the property of someone who paid attention, who looked after things, who was present in the physical world in a thorough and consistent way. Clement met them at the door. He had made an effort, she could see. His hair was combed and he wore a clean shirt, and he had clearly spent some portion of the morning making the front room habitable for company. There was a fire in the fireplace and the smell of something roasting from the kitchen, and a table large enough for 8 that had been set with actual china and a linen tablecloth. "The tablecloth was my mother's," he said, when he caught Winifred looking at it. "I found it in the chest upstairs. Seemed like a good occasion." She did not trust herself to respond to that adequately, so she simply said, "It's beautiful," and went to help in the kitchen. There were 7 of them at dinner that Sunday, including Aldous Crane and his wife, and a neighboring rancher named Beaumont Hicks, who was a red-faced, cheerful man with opinions about cattle prices that occupied him throughout the main course. The food was straightforward ranch fare: roasted beef and root vegetables and bread that someone had brought from the bakery in town, and it was good, generous food. And the conversation around it was warm and uncomplicated in the way that meals with people who like each other tend to be. Winifred sat across from Clement and watched him in his own home and understood something about him that she had not quite had language for before. He was a person who was most completely himself in the context of taking care of things. He watched the table to see when something needed refilling. He listened when anyone spoke with the quality of attention that meant they always felt heard. When Aldous Crane made a joke that landed flat, Clement laughed anyway, not performatively but genuinely, because he could see that Aldous had been trying, and he did not want the man to feel foolish. He was, she realized, one of those rare people who move through the world with a constant low-level concern for the comfort of the people around him that was so natural it barely registered as kindness. It just registered as how things were when he was in the room. After dinner, while Martha and Rosie and Mrs. Crane were in the kitchen with the dishes, and Beaumont Hicks was explaining something about cattle to Aldous Crane by the fireplace, Winifred stood at the window looking out at the dark December ranch. Clement came to stand beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and offered her one without preamble. "Tell me something," she said, looking out at the winter dark. "What do you want to know? Why you're alone?" She said it directly, the way she tended to say things that mattered. "This house, this table, it's clearly meant for more people than just you." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the cottonwoods were silver in the moonlight. "I was engaged once," he said. "She was a girl from Abilene, came out here with her family when I was 26. We were engaged for 7 months, and then her family moved to California and she decided she wasn't going to stay in Texas. She asked me to come with her." He turned his coffee cup in one hand. "I couldn't leave the ranch. It was the first year after my father died and there was no one else to run it. I thought she understood that, but she'd already decided. She left. She left." He looked out the window. "I don't blame her particularly. California is a beautiful place and Dusty Creek is a small town in the middle of flat land. She made the choice that made sense for her. But it hurt." "Yes." He turned to look at her then. "Things hurt until they don't, and then you get on with it. That's a very practical way to grieve." "I'm a practical man." "You are," she agreed, "but I don't think you're as practical as you make yourself sound." He looked at her steadily. "What makes you say that?" "A practical man wouldn't have his mother's tablecloth on the table for a Sunday dinner," she said. "And he wouldn't remember which piece of apple he gave the Vargas girl. And he wouldn't go to Aldous Crane without telling me about it because he didn't want me to count on something that might not come through." The silence between them was different from other silences. It had a texture and a warmth to it, the way the air in a room changes when a fire has been burning for a while. "You notice things," he said softly. "So do you," she said. They stood at the window together for a while longer, not touching, not speaking, watching the winter dark beyond the glass, and it was perhaps the most intimate thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with the particular fierce beauty of a West Texas December, which was to say, the sky was the most spectacular blue imaginable, and the cold came in off the plains at night like a wall. The children in Winifred's schoolroom made paper stars and strung them along the windows, and she taught them carols and had them write letters home to parents they were not currently speaking to, a practical exercise in reconciliation that she had invented herself and which she thought worked rather well. On Christmas Eve, there was a gathering at the church, and Winifred stood with Martha and Rosie and sang hymns in the cold stone room with candles lit and the voices of the town rising together. And she thought about the last Christmas in San Antonio, in her rented room with the dismissal letter still sitting on her desk and the future looking extremely blank. She thought about it, and then she let it go, the way you let go of something heavy when your arms are finally strong enough to set it down. Clement Warren stood 3 rows back in the church, and she knew this because she had noticed it, and she had stopped pretending to herself that she did not notice things about him as a matter of habit. After the service, in the churchyard under a sky full of stars that were so bright and close they seemed personally interested in the proceedings below them, he appeared beside her with his coat collar turned up against the cold and said, "Merry Christmas, Winifred." It was the first time he had used her name. He had been calling her Miss Collins since the saloon, with the careful formality of someone who is aware of observing proprieties. She felt the shift of it somewhere in her sternum. "Merry Christmas, Clement," she said. They stood under the stars and the town moved around them, neighbors calling to neighbors, children running between adults, wagon horses standing patient in the cold. It should have been a moment for saying something further, something that acknowledged the weight of what had been accumulating between them over weeks of coffee cups and corner tables and honest conversations. But neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was so companionable and so full that words felt beside the point. He walked her back to Martha's in the end because the night was cold and the road was dark, and at the gate he stopped and said, "I'd like to take you out riding on the New Year, just to see the ranch, if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded. "Good night, then." "Good night, Clement." She went inside and stood just inside the door for a moment while her heart did something entirely unreasonable. And then she went up to her room and sat in the dark, smiling at the ceiling with an abandon she was glad no one could see. January arrived, and with it the riding invitation, and the morning Clement pulled his wagon up to Martha Haskell's house at 9 in the morning on New Year's Day. Winifred was already standing on the porch with her coat on and her good boots, which she had cleaned the night before with more care than the occasion strictly required. He had saddled a second horse for her, a calm dun mare named Birdie, and they rode out across the winter range together, following fence lines and creek beds through the dormant landscape. And he showed her the ranch the way a person shows something they love when they want someone else to see why they love it. He showed her the spring that fed the creek, which in summer was clear and cold and bordered by cottonwoods that went gold in October. He showed her the hilltop where you could see 30 miles in every direction, and where the sky was the entirety of everything. He showed her the section of fence his father had put up himself, the posts still solid after 20 years, and he ran his hand along one of the rails in a way that was half practical inspection and half something else entirely. He was a good man, Clement said. Hard the way men of that generation had to be to make something work out here, but fair. He was always fair. "You miss him," Winifred said, "every day." He looked out at the plain. The silence in that house took about a year to stop being wrong. She thought about her own silences, the ones in rented rooms in cities she had not managed to belong to. "I know something about silences that feel wrong," she said. He looked at her. They were on the hilltop, the winter sun low and broad, the plain spread out before them in every direction, and there was nowhere to go that was not right there. "You've been moving a long time," he said. It was not a question. "Since I was 22, she said. 5 towns in 8 years, always finding the work and then something going sideways. San Antonio was the longest, 4 years, and then the thing with Harriet Boone and the gossip and the letter, and then I was packing again. What are you looking for when you move?" She thought about this honestly. "Somewhere that feels like mine," she said. "Somewhere I can stop explaining myself." He looked at her for a long, still moment in the winter light, and then he said, very quietly, "You don't have to explain yourself to me." The space between them on horseback was not very much space at all, and the cold was very present, and the sun was very bright, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she thought, with tremendous and somewhat helpless clarity, that she was in a very great deal of trouble where this man was concerned. She did not say so, but she did not have to. He reached across the space between the horses and offered her his hand, not to lead or to take anything, just to offer. And she put her hand in his, and they sat on the hilltop like that for a while, in the January cold, watching the 30-mile view, and nothing needed to be said about it. Winter deepened and slowly gave way. February in West Texas has a particular quality of light that is neither winter nor spring but something in between, a tentative brightness that arrives each afternoon and retreats quickly as the sun drops toward the horizon. Winifred learned this with the kind of absorbed attention she gave to new landscapes, walking out in the mornings to see what the day was doing and what the sky had decided about itself. She understood by now, happy. This was not an uncomplicated state for her. She was a woman who had spent a considerable amount of her adult life managing situations that were difficult, navigating institutions that required her to be smaller than she was, packing and unpacking and starting over. Happiness had a quality of precariousness to it that she was not entirely comfortable with. It felt like something that could be taken back. Hattie Morse had not given up, which was both predictable and occasionally exhausting. Hattie had pivoted from the school board campaign to a broader social strategy, which involved making it quietly understood among the ladies, auxiliary, that Winifred Collins was not to be fully embraced. This resulted in a kind of lukewarm courtesy from several women in town, not unfriendliness exactly, but a careful distance that made itself felt in the way invitations were extended or not extended. But Martha Haskell remained staunchly in her corner, and Rosie Delacroix had become a genuine friend, stopping by the schoolhouse in the late afternoons with news from the post office and opinions about everything, delivered with great energy. And there were the parents of her students, who one by one had begun to thaw into something warmer than professional approval. The Vargas family, whose youngest daughter Maria had been struggling with reading, sent a jar of homemade jam to the schoolhouse when Maria completed her first full reader. Winifred had put the jam on the shelf by the window where she could see it, and she looked at it frequently as a kind of talisman. And there was Clement. There was always Clement now, in the background and increasingly in the foreground of her days. He came to town most Saturdays for supplies, and he had developed a habit of stopping by the schoolhouse after the children left, knocking on the open door and leaning against the frame with his hat in his hands, and they would sit on the steps in the late afternoon sun and talk. They talked about everything, the ranch and the school and the town and the wider world, and things they had read and things they had thought, and things they had wondered about in the dark of their respective lonely houses. She had never talked to anyone the way she talked to Clement Warren. She had not known before that it was possible to talk to someone with that particular quality of ease, the sense that you could say the thing you actually thought rather than the edited version, and that the thing you actually thought would be received without flinching. He was honest and he was steady, and he had what she had come to think of as a remarkable absence of pretense, a quality that was rarer than it should have been in her experience. She was also, increasingly and undeniably, in love with him. This was both a wonderful and a deeply unsettling thing to know. She turned it over in her mind on her morning walks and in the evenings by Martha's fire, examining it from all sides with the thoroughness she applied to problems that required careful thinking. She was 30 years old. She had been dismissed from one job for the appearance of an improper relationship with a man. She was living in a town that had already tried to push her out once. Getting publicly, visibly attached to the man who was perhaps the most prominent rancher in the county would be either the best or the worst thing she could do, and she was not entirely sure which. She was, in this state of unresolved analysis, sitting on the schoolhouse steps on a Thursday in late February when Clement arrived slightly earlier than usual and sat down beside her and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you are perfectly free to say no." She put down the papers she was grading. "All right." He was turned toward her slightly, with the serious, careful look of a man who has been preparing something. "I have been thinking about this since January," he said, "since the hilltop. I have been trying to figure out the right time to say it, and I have concluded that there is no particularly right time, and that waiting for one is just an excuse I'm making. Clement, I know you've got complicated feelings about this town and about your situation in it, and I know that Hattie Morse has made things harder than they should be, and I know you've been moving from place to place for a long time, and you're still not sure this is where you're stopping. He looked at her directly. I want to know if you think it could be, not because I'm asking you to decide anything right now, just whether it's possible. She understood that this was not a declaration precisely. It was something more careful than that, a man asking whether the door was worth walking through before he committed fully to the walking. She respected it tremendously. I think, she said slowly, that this is the first place I've been in a very long time where I feel like the person I actually am. Not the story someone else is telling about me, just myself. She met his eyes, and I think you have a great deal to do with that. Something moved through his expression, relief and warmth, and something more than either. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said. Not a group dinner, just you and me, at the hotel restaurant on Saturday. In public, she said, understanding what he was saying. In public, he confirmed. I know that means something. In terms of what people will say, Hattie Morse will have something to say about it. Hattie Morse always has something to say about everything, he said. I've been making decisions based on what's right rather than what she thinks for 37 years, and I intend to keep doing so. Winifred felt something shift inside her, some last remaining piece of the caution and the self-protection that she had built up over 8 years of packing and unpacking and starting over. It shifted and settled into something quieter. Saturday dinner, she said. Yes. He smiled then, a real and complete smile, and it transformed his face in a way that she found somewhat overwhelming. She looked back at her papers with the composure of a woman who is doing her best. Saturday, he confirmed, and went back to his horse with a lightness in his step that was entirely out of character with his usual economy of movement, and that she pretended not to notice, and that she was going to think about later with a great deal of private pleasure. The dinner was, by the standards of Dusty Creek, an event. Not because anything happened, but because the hotel restaurant occupied the most visible corner of the main street and had large windows. And by 9 o'clock on Saturday evening, every person in the town who mattered to the social ledger was aware that Clement Warren had taken Miss Collins to dinner. They ate roasted chicken and potatoes and apple pie, and they talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. And at one point, Clement reached across the table and covered her hand with his and left it there. And she turned her hand over and held his. And they did this in full view of the large windows, and neither of them looked around to see who was watching. Hattie Morse, it was subsequently reported, had walked past the hotel on her way to Edith Sallow's house, and had looked through the window, and had then walked considerably faster to her destination. Whatever she said at Edith Sallow's house went unrecorded, but Edith Sallow came into the general store the following Monday with an expression that suggested she had received a great deal of information and was not entirely comfortable with any of it. Winifred did not care. This was new. She noted it with something close to wonder. She was actively, practically not caring what Hattie Morse thought about her dinner, and it did not feel like defiance or bravery. It felt like freedom. Spring arrived in West Texas with its customary sudden extravagance, the range grass going green almost overnight, the creek running full, the air warming from thin and cold to something that carried actual warmth in it. Winifred's classroom filled with the sounds of children who were having difficulty staying inside and focusing on their slates, and she developed a new curriculum element involving outdoor observation that was partly pedagogically motivated and partly a concession to reality. She and Clement had been courting, openly and with increasing warmth, since the February dinner. He brought her wildflowers from the ranch when he came to town on Saturdays, practical bundles of whatever was blooming that he held out with matter-of-fact generosity. They went riding on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted. They attended the Easter Sunday service together, which caused a murmur that subsided within the week, because it turned out that the congregation, faced with the fact of them side by side in a pew, found it much harder to muster disapproval than Hattie Morse had anticipated. Hattie Morse, to be accurate about it, was losing ground. The school board confirmation had been the turning point, and the subsequent months had made it clear that Winifred Collins was a good teacher and a decent person, and was not leaving, and that Clement Warren had made his position evident by his actions in a way that no amount of implication could override. The tide of opinion in Dusty Creek, which had been wavering since October, had settled by April into something reasonably favorable. Not universal, there were still women who held themselves at a careful distance, but the active campaign against her had lost its energy. Even Edith Sallow, who ran into Winifred at the dry goods store one Thursday and was unable to avoid her, managed a stiff but genuine, "The children look well taught, Miss Collins," before retreating to the ribbon display. Winifred accepted this as the diplomatic breakthrough it was intended to be. The evening in April that became the most important evening of that year arrived without particular announcement. Clement had come to take her to dinner, and after dinner they walked along the creek road as they sometimes did, and the evening was warm enough that they were not hurrying against the cold, and the stars were coming out one by one above the greening plains, and they had been talking for a while before the talking gradually shifted into a comfortable silence, and in that silence Clement stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was holding his hat, not turning it, just holding it still, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of all the careful practicality that he usually carried in front of himself like a kind of polite shield. "I love you," he said. The words were simple and level and so clearly true that they required no decoration. Winifred looked at him standing in the April evening on the creek road with the stars coming out and the frogs singing from the water somewhere to their left, and she felt the full accumulated weight of everything: the 8 years of moving, the dismissal, the train journey, the broken plate, the corner table, the hilltop in January, the flowers on Saturday mornings, the way he had remembered the apple and the Vargas girl. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to say so for several months, and I am very relieved to be done with that particular project." He laughed, that full and unexpected laugh that she had heard only a few times and that remained, each time, a small revelation. And then he stepped forward and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her once with a gentleness that somehow contained everything that had been building between them since October, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms, steady and warm and present. The spring night lay around them, fragrant and enormous, and the creek moved on its way, and the stars continued their business above them, and Winifred Collins stood in Dusty Creek, Texas, with her hands over Clement Warren's heart, and understood with the clarity of something finally resolved that she was home. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in May. They were on the hilltop, the same hilltop where they had held hands in January, but in May it was covered in wild flowers, Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets and tiny yellow things she did not know the name of, and the 30-mile view was green and warm and full of the particular sweetness of a West Texas spring. He got down on one knee, which seemed to surprise him slightly, as though his body had made the decision before he had quite finished formulating the gesture, and he held out a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the afternoon sun. "Winifred," he said, "I want to build the rest of my life with you. I want that house to be a home for both of us. I want to grow old in this place with you, and I want there to be more people at that table every year." He paused. "I know you've had a hard road getting here. I know this town has not always been kind to you, but I will spend every day of my life making sure you are glad you stayed." She was not, as she had established, a woman who cried easily, but her eyes were bright in the afternoon sun when she said yes, and her voice had something in it that she was not bothering to conceal. He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she kissed him on the hilltop with the wildflowers all around them and the 30-mile view stretching out in every direction. And somewhere in the town 4 miles south, she was certain, Hattie Morse was probably saying something. But standing on that hilltop with Clement Warren's ring on her hand and his arms around her, she found she could not locate any corner of herself that was concerned about it. They were married in August on a Saturday in the church in Dusty Creek. It was not a small wedding, which surprised Winifred, who had imagined something quiet. But it turned out that Clement Warren had a great many people who wished him well and who had extended that goodwill by the spring to include her, and so the church was full. Martha Haskell sat in the front row and cried openly and without apology. Rosie Delacroix had somehow organized the flowers, wildflowers and late summer blossoms that filled the church with warmth and color. Aldous Crane gave a reading. Beaumont Hicks managed to get through the reception without saying too much about cattle prices. Hattie Morse was not in attendance. She had sent a gift, which was a sufficiently astounding social maneuver that Winifred and Martha and Rosie had discussed it for 20 minutes before concluding that it was probably Hattie's version of a white flag, delivered in the medium she understood, which was the social gesture. Winifred wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, a cream-colored thing with small pearl buttons that she had carried with her through all 5 towns and all 8 years, always folded at the bottom of her trunk, waiting for an occasion that had taken a very long time to arrive. When she walked down the aisle and saw Clement at the end of it, watching her come toward him with everything in his face that he usually kept carefully contained, she was very glad she had kept the dress. They said their vows in the plain, direct language of 1883, and the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Clement kissed her while the congregation applauded, and little Maria Vargas, who had come with her family, threw a handful of flower petals that landed mostly on the head of the boy sitting in front of her. The reception was held on the ranch, which Winifred had spent the preceding 2 weeks helping to prepare, and which looked in August evening light like the most welcoming place on earth. The long table from the dining room had been brought outside and extended with a second table, and covered with everything anyone had thought to bring, and there were lanterns hung in the cottonwoods that came on as the sun went down, and someone had a fiddle, and the night was warm, and people stayed late. Clement found her at one point standing slightly apart from the crowd at the edge of the lantern light, looking out at the dark ranch, and he came to stand beside her with his shoulder against hers. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, without reservation. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood at the edge of the light looking out at the dark for a while, as they had stood at his window in December looking out at the winter night, and it felt continuous with all the moments before it and full of all the moments ahead. The first year of their marriage was full in the way that good years are, busy with real things, the ranch work and the school, and the business of 2 lives becoming one. Winifred kept teaching, which had been the subject of precisely 0 debate between them. She had made it clear when he proposed, and he had made it equally clear that he would not dream of suggesting otherwise. The school board, by this time, had stopped being anxious about her, and had moved on to being anxious about the schoolhouse roof, which needed replacing, and Aldous Crane had become a reliable ally who consulted her about curriculum decisions with genuine respect. The ranch was a learning process. She knew nothing about cattle when she arrived, and by the following spring she knew considerably more, in the way that you learn things when they are the daily reality of the person you love. She learned the rhythm of the ranch year, the calving season in late winter that meant Clement was up at all hours and came to breakfast with his coat still on, the branding in spring, the summer work of fence maintenance and water management, the fall cattle drive to the railhead at Abilene that he took with 2 hired hands and that occupied 3 weeks, and during which she missed him with a specificity that surprised her. In October of their first year, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she watched his face go through a series of things that ended in an expression she had no existing word for, something composed of wonder and fear and joy and fierce protective love all arriving simultaneously. "You're sure?" he said. "I am sure," she said. He reached across the table and covered both her hands with both of his, the way he had covered her hand at their first dinner, and he held them for a long moment without speaking, and then he said very softly, "Thank you." She raised an eyebrow. "I think we were both involved in this." He laughed, startled out of solemnity, and she laughed too, and the kitchen was full of the warm light of the lamp, and the smell of the supper they had eaten and the weight of everything that was coming. And it was good. The baby was a boy, born in June of 1884, in the bedroom of the Warren Ranch house with the midwife from town and Martha Haskell present, and Clement pacing the front room with the kind of focused agitation that is the exclusive province of new fathers. He was named Thomas, after Clement's father. He was red-faced and loud and entirely perfect, and when Clement held him for the first time he stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at his son with an expression that reduced Martha Haskell to happy tears again, which she managed with her usual efficiency. "Hello, Thomas," Clement said, very quietly, to the small red face looking up at him. "I have been waiting a long time to meet you." Winifred, in the bed, watched her husband hold their son and felt the fullness of it, the particular weight and warmth of a life that has arrived at the place it was always trying to reach. Dusty Creek in 1884 was a town in the process of becoming something larger than it had been. The railroad was coming closer every year, and with it, the prospect of faster commerce and more settlers. The school was growing, and by September Winifred had 27 students, and the school board was discussing the need for a second classroom. She was managing this with Thomas at 6 months on Martha Haskell's hip, because Martha had appointed herself grandmother in all but the technical sense, which was an arrangement that suited everyone involved. Hattie Morse had completed her retreat from the field by the end of their first year. The wedding had been the definitive moment. Clement Warren was the most respected man in the county, and Winifred Collins was now Winifred Warren, and had been teaching the community's children for over a year with results that parents were vocally pleased with, and the story that Hattie had tried to write about her had simply not held up against the reality that people could see with their own eyes every day. Hattie was not, to be clear, a changed woman. She was still a woman who talked, and who found it necessary to comment on the proceedings of others. But the particular focus she had aimed at Winifred had shifted. There were other targets, other situations to analyze and distribute opinions about. And occasionally, very occasionally, Winifred would hear something secondhand that suggested Hattie had said something neutral or even mildly complimentary about the school, and she received this information with the equanimity of someone who no longer needed it to be true. There was one afternoon in the fall of their second year when she passed Hattie Morse on the main street with Thomas in the perambulator that Clement had ordered specially from a catalog, and Hattie stopped and looked into the perambulator at Thomas, who was at that age where babies seem specifically designed to make strangers smile. "He has his father's eyes," Hattie said. "He does," Winifred agreed. They looked at each other for a moment across the perambulator, across a year and a half of everything that had happened between them, or rather between Hattie and her interpretation of Winifred. And Hattie gave a single short nod, the kind of nod that a proud woman gives when she is conceding something without quite being willing to say what it is, and she walked on down the street. Winifred stood on the boardwalk and watched her go, and then looked down at Thomas, who had grabbed the edge of the perambulator with both hands and was regarding the world above him with the benign curiosity of a person who has not yet learned to find it complicated. "Well," she said to him, "that might be the closest we get to an apology." Thomas looked at her and made a sound that could have been anything. "I'll take it," she agreed. The second pregnancy arrived when Thomas was 16 months old, announced in the same kitchen with the same lamp on a Sunday evening, and Clement's face did the same remarkable series of things it had done the first time, and they were both laughing by the end of it, which felt right. This baby was a girl, born in the spring of 1886, dark-haired like her mother, and loud like her father had apparently been as an infant, according to a story Martha Haskell told with great relish at the first opportunity. They named her Eleanor, and she arrived into a household that was by now full and warm and well-worn in the way that good homes become, with toys underfoot, and the smell of bread from the kitchen and the sounds of Thomas, who was by then an active toddler with a great deal to say about everything. The school continued to grow, and in the spring of 1887, the second classroom opened with a second teacher, a young woman named Agnes Park, who arrived from Dallas with excellent credentials and a slightly wary expression that Winifred recognized from her own first days in the town. She took Agnes to the Silver Spur Saloon for coffee on her first afternoon, sat her at the corner table and said, "I want to tell you some things about this town that will be useful to know. The first is that the school board is on your side. The second is that there is a woman named Hattie Morse who will form an opinion about you within the week, and my recommendation is to do your job well and let reality answer for you. And the third is that Martha Haskell is worth more than anyone you'll meet here, and you should trust her completely." Agnes Park, who had been to some degree dreading this conversation, looked at her across the table with something between gratitude and relief. "Is it very difficult?" she asked. "Getting established here?" "It was for me," Winifred said honestly, "but it got better faster than I expected." She thought about Clement in the doorway of this saloon, 8 years ago now, ducking under the frame with his hat in his hands. Sometimes the thing that makes it better arrives when you least expect it and looks completely different from what you imagined. Agnes Park turned out to be an excellent teacher and a fine addition to the school, and she and Winifred developed over the following year the kind of professional friendship that is built on shared purpose and mutual respect, and the occasional shared exasperation about the school board's relationship with the concept of adequate funding. The years moved forward with the quality of time that is content, which is to say they moved at the right speed and left the right things behind and carried forward what mattered. Thomas started at his mother's school at age 5, which was a source of considerable entertainment to both his parents and a matter of complex feeling for Thomas himself, who could not entirely work out how to feel about being a student in his mother's classroom. He was, like his father, a quiet and observant child who turned out to be especially good at mathematics, a development that delighted Winifred professionally and personally. Eleanor, by contrast, arrived at the age of verbal communication like a force of nature that had been temporarily contained in a smaller form and was now expressing its full dimensions. She talked constantly and with great conviction, and she had opinions about everything, including the proper way to saddle a horse, the unfairness of bedtimes, and the question of whether the barn cat was being adequately appreciated by the family. She was, Clement said on more than one occasion, exactly like her mother, and he said it with a warmth and a pride that made it unmistakably a compliment. Winifred, for her part, thought Eleanor was more like her father than either of them admitted, in the way she loved the ranch, the way she followed Clement around during the morning work with the focus of someone memorizing something important, the way she had his particular capacity for stillness when something required close attention. Rosie Delacroix married a man named Samuel Falk, who came through Dusty Creek on a surveying job, and stayed for reasons that became obvious to everyone within the week. She announced it to Winifred in the post office with the fullness of her whole-chest laugh, and they embraced over the counter with the ease of women, who are genuinely glad for each other. Winifred stood beside her at the wedding, as Rosie had stood beside her at hers, and the circle of it felt right and complete. Martha Haskell remained in her place at the center of Winifred's life with the unchanging solidity of a landmark. She was at every birthday and every Christmas and every significant occasion, and she held each of the Warren children with the authority of someone who has decided they belong to her, which they accepted without question. She grew older with the grace of a woman who has always used herself well, slower in the winters but bright as ever, and Winifred made a point of visiting her on Sunday afternoons when Clement was managing the ranch, sitting in her kitchen with tea and the frank and comfortable conversation of two people who have been honest with each other from the beginning. In the spring of 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Alina was 4, Winifred discovered she was pregnant a third time. She told Clement in the kitchen, which was where she always told him things that mattered, and he covered her hands with his across the table, and they looked at each other with the smile of two people who have been very lucky and know it. 3, he said. 3, she agreed. The table is going to need to be bigger. We've managed before. He turned her hand over and held it properly, his thumb moving over her ring, which she still wore every day and which had been cleaned once by a traveling jeweler, and had acquired the particular worn quality of something that has been on a person's hand long enough to become part of them. "Are you happy?" He asked her the same question from the wedding night, and she understood it was a question he would always ask, not because he doubted the answer but because he was the kind of man who liked to confirm what mattered. "Yes," she said, the same answer, without reservation. The third baby was a boy, born in November of 1890 and named James, after no one in particular but a name both of them liked the sound of. He arrived with Thomas's quietness and Alina's stubbornness, and his own particular laugh, which started early and arrived often and was, in the opinion of everyone who heard it, the most infectious thing they had encountered. The Warren Ranch house, which had always felt slightly too large for one person, and then just right for two and comfortable for four, became by 1891 a house that was very much lived in, full of the controlled chaos of 3 children at various stages of needing things, and the particular warmth of a home that has been loved into comfort over years. Winifred still walked her morning walks, earlier now, before the children were fully awake, a 30-minute circuit of the ranch road and back that gave her the silence she needed to face the day with equanimity. On clear mornings, she sometimes encountered Clement already out, checking on the cattle in the early light, and they would walk together for a while in the quiet before the day began. These morning walks became their own kind of conversation, different from the evening ones. The mornings were for the practical and the immediate, the day's plans and the week's concerns, and the small decisions that a ranch and a school and a family required. The evenings, when the children were settled and the house was quiet, were for the larger things, what they thought and felt and wondered about, the kind of talking that was both easy and important. Dusty Creek had grown considerably by 1891. The railroad had arrived in 1888, and with it, a wave of settlers and commerce that had transformed the town from a small community into something with genuine economic momentum. There was a proper hotel now, not just the dining room but a real hotel with 16 rooms. There was a bank and a doctor's office and a dry goods store that had doubled in size. The school had 3 classrooms by 1889 and 4 teachers, including Winifred, who had become what she had once imagined from a distance, a principal of sorts, the longest-serving and most experienced of the teachers, the one whom the school board consulted on matters of curriculum, and the one whom new teachers sought out when they were trying to find their footing. She had been in Dusty Creek for 8 years by then, the same number of years she had spent moving before she arrived. She was 38 years old, and she felt, in some important way, more completely herself than she had ever been. Not because life was without difficulty. It was not. The ranch had hard years, and the school had its frustrations, and children were sometimes difficult, and bodies sometimes ached in winter in ways they had not before. But the difficulty was the difficulty of a life that was actually hers, rooted in a place and in people and in work that mattered, and it was entirely different in quality from the difficulty of being adrift. The last significant crisis of that period arrived in the winter of 1892. James, who was 2, developed a severe fever in January that brought the doctor out twice from town, and that lasted a week and was genuinely frightening. Clement did not sleep for 3 nights in a row, and Winifred kept her hand on James's chest through the worst of it, measuring his breathing, talking to him in a low, steady voice, because she had read that it helped, and because she could not think of anything else to do with her hands. The doctor was a capable man named Horace Briggs who had come with the railroad years, and who treated the situation with calm competence, and was honest about his concern without manufacturing a panic. He sat in the kitchen with Clement on the second night, and talked to him plainly about what they were dealing with, and what to watch for, and what he expected. And Clement listened with his hands flat on the table, and his face set in the particular stillness of someone who is not permitting themselves to respond to what they are afraid of, because there is no productive outlet for it right now. The fever broke on the 5th day at 3 in the morning, and Winifred was there when it happened, sitting in the chair beside James's bed with the lamp turned low, and she felt the change before she confirmed it, a quality shift in the room, a loosening of something that had been tight. She pressed her palm to his forehead, and it was cooler, definitively cooler, and she put her head down on the edge of the bed and exhaled something that had been held inside her since Monday. Clement was there within minutes. She had not called to him, but he appeared in the doorway, and she looked up at him and said, "The fever is down." And he came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her and gathered her against him, and she let herself be held in the profound and wordless way of 2 people who have just come through something frightening together. James recovered completely and demonstrated his recovery with characteristic energy over the following 2 weeks, running through the house and demanding to see the horses and consuming quantities of food that seemed improbable for his size. Winifred watched him from the kitchen window one afternoon in February, running across the yard after a leaner with his arms out and his mouth open, and his entire body expressing pure animal joy at being alive and moving. And she thought about everything that could be lost and everything that had not been lost, and she was grateful with the full force of a person who has reason to be. That spring she and Clement sat on the porch in the April evening, the same porch they had sat on dozens of times over the years, in the warm air that smelled of new grass and the wood smoke from the kitchen stove, and they watched the last of the sunset go out over the plains. Thomas was inside with his arithmetic. Alina was attempting to teach the barn cat something, the nature of the lesson unclear. James was asleep, still sleeping earlier than the others, still rebuilding his strength. "I was thinking," Clement said, in the slow way that meant he had been thinking about it for a while, "that we ought to expand the east pasture. There's good grass out there and we're going to need the range." "Yes," she said, because she had heard enough about the ranch over 9 years to have a genuine opinion about the east pasture. He looked at her sideways. "You actually thought about that. I always think about it when you bring it up." He smiled. "You know more about cattle than you did when you got here." "I know more about everything than I did when I got here," she said, "including myself." He reached over and took her hand. They sat like that, as they had sat on the hilltop in January of their first year, his hand holding hers in the evening air, and the plains stretched out before them, and the stars were beginning, and the sounds of the ranch at day's end settled around them like something familiar and dear. "Thank you for staying," he said. It was not something he said often. He was a man who showed things rather than saying them. But occasionally he said things, and when he did they were precise and they were true. "Thank you for the corner table," she said. "In October 1882, when a woman you didn't know had just thrown a plate at your neighbor's head, 2 inches to the left of her head. You noticed that too?" "I notice everything about you," he said. "I always have." She looked at him in the gathering dark, this steady, serious, endlessly decent man who had offered a stranger a seat when no one else would, who had gone to Aldous Crane quietly and without telling her, who had gotten down on one knee in a field of wildflowers and asked her to let him spend the rest of his life making sure she was glad she had stayed. She looked at him and felt the full accumulated weight of everything they had built together and everything that lay ahead of them. The east pasture and the children getting older, and the school continuing to grow, and the mornings walking the ranch road and the evenings on this porch watching the stars come out over the Texas plains. "I am glad," she said, "every single day." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so quiet and complete that it asked for nothing and said everything. The stars continued to come out above them, and from inside the house came the sound of Alina's voice, instructing someone or something with great conviction, and from the yard, the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwoods, and from somewhere out on the range, the ordinary and familiar sounds of a ranch at rest. Winifred Collins, who had arrived in Dusty Creek on a train with a misrouted trunk and mud on her hem and fire in her eyes, who had thrown a plate at a wall and walked across a saloon floor to a stranger's corner table, who had stood in front of a school board and refused to be diminished, who had loved a man on a hilltop in January and married him in August and built with him a life that was rooted and real and full, sat on her porch in the April evening and held her husband's hand. And she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had always been the kind of woman who knew when she arrived somewhere whether it was the place she had been looking for. This was the place. This had always been the place. And in the town 4 miles south, in the general store and the post office and the school with its 4 classrooms and its bright winter windows, and in the memories of people who had been there in October of 1882 when a woman had walked across a saloon floor in muddy boots to sit at a rancher's table and begin the rest of her life, the story of Winifred Collins and Clement Warren had long since stopped being gossip. It was simply the truth of how some things begin, and of what can be built, when one person offers a seat at a table and another person has the courage to take it.